Yeah, so let's have a conversation for a second about marriage. And if you're single out there, I don't want you to tune this out. This isn't just for people who are married. I think really this is a conversation we want to have because it affects all of us, our understanding of marriage, how we relate to it. Oftentimes we can have misunderstandings, a lot of misunderstandings around the topic of marriage. So what does the Bible say about marriage? Well, anytime you ask that question, what does the Bible say, that can be unique because different parts of Scripture point to different ideas related to marriage. Our job in theology often is to bring those different parts together to try to see what is the witness across the biblical narrative about a certain topic or issue, or, that's why those are the sort of conversations we love to have here at Everyday Theology. So what do we see across Scripture when it comes to marriage? Well, I think the first thing, or the starting place that we want to begin this discussion is, how does the Bible bear witness to the origin of marriage? Where does marriage come from? Where does the idea come from? What really is kind of the foundation for our understanding of the nature of this unique relationship? Well, if you go all the way back to the very beginning and the creation accounts of Scripture, we actually see where the origin of marriage comes from. And so, quick recap, in Genesis 1 and 2, we have the account of creation. Genesis 1 kind of gives us the big picture account of how God created everything that we know, the heavens and the earth. And then Genesis 2 kind of lasers in a little bit on God's unique creation of the space he created for humanity, what's known as the Garden of Eden, and then really humanity itself. And in Genesis 2, God makes reference that it's not good that man should be alone. So God creates Adam out of the ground. He recognizes that he in and of himself is sufficient for bearing the image of God and following God's call in the world. And so he creates out of Adam this woman, Eve. And then in Genesis 2:24, we have a really unique verse. It's there that it says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife," or join to his wife, "and the two shall become one." Now, Jen, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Did Adam and Eve have parents?
They had a father.
They did? Well, God, I guess, technically. So, tricky answer, yeah. Yeah, technically they had a father or a creator. So, good point. I'm glad you brought some theological clarity.
Right.
Did they have a mom, though?
They did not.
No. So, if Genesis 2:24 is a reference to someone leaving a mother and a father, is that talking about Adam and Eve?
It is not.
It is not. So that's a really interesting verse. You have this whole narrative about creation, and then the author, for some reason, after woman's created, stops and kind of inserts this whole verse out of nowhere. Well, this verse we would call the institution of marriage, because the author, what traditionally most people understand is Moses, is actually looking at God's creation of male and female, and he's giving a kind of principle or a kind of institution of a unique relationship out of that creation. And he essentially notes that there's three things that happen because of the way God created men and women: that a man shall leave his father and mother, meaning his family of origin. He will actually join. This is the language of clinging, cleaving, joining, uniting together, which, as we see later in Scripture, is really the idea of a covenantal relationship, meaning it's unique to those people. And then the two become one flesh. They become one entity, their own family unit. And so the institution of marriage is actually born out of God's unique work of creation. And that's why I think when we think about the origin of marriage, one of the things we really need to understand is that marriage is ultimately defined, it's designed and it's defined by God. It's not a man-made institution. It's a God-instituted reality that comes out of the way he actually designed the world to be. And it's a unique relationship that God gave the first human beings in Adam and Eve, and then proceeded to give as a gift to subsequent human beings. Now, that can raise some questions about singleness. We can answer those in a whole separate video. But right now, we just want to focus on marriage. And so when we recognize that, we realize that when it comes to actually defining marriage, we do not get the luxury of defining that. Marriage was already defined in the act of creation. This is why, as people come along and they try to redefine marriage in some respect, I think as Christians, we would say that's not really our place. If marriage is actually born out of God's unique creative design, then he's the one who gets to give the definition. And he gives a clear definition. It's a male and a female who leave their family of origin, unite in covenant, and then form their own family unit. That's God's original design. And what's interesting is almost any time, well, not almost any time, actually any time the discussions of marriage come up later within Scripture, it's this verse that is referenced. For instance, Jesus has a discussion about marriage in Matthew 19. And you know what verse he quotes? Genesis 2:24. Paul has a discussion about marriage when he writes to the church in Ephesus. And what verse does he quote? Genesis 2:24. And so we see throughout the narrative of Scripture that this verse is really the foundation. It describes the origins of marriage, recognizes God's design, and it informs how we then understand the relationship from there on out. So that's the origin of marriage. But I think one of the other things that we want to understand when it comes to marriage is, but what's its larger purpose? So if that's where it starts, what actually is the purpose of marriage? Well, part of the purpose of marriage is to fulfill God's initial creation mandate to humanity in general, which was to fill the earth and subdue it. Ultimately, our job was to take the flourishing that was in Eden and to extend it to the ends of the earth, to bring creation out of its chaos into order, to rule and reign over it under the rule and reign of God so that there would be flourishing for all. And marriage is a part of that work. We have things like procreation that comes out of marriage. We have the unique complementary reality of male and female and the way they work together to fill that. So part of the purpose of marriage is God's original intention in creation. But Scripture even points to something more magnificent beyond that for the purpose of marriage. So I mentioned Paul writes to the church in Ephesus, and he gives them a lot of instructions on marriage. Really, he's giving a number of instructions on households. And part of that is because Ephesians is really, it's almost like a constitution for the church. It gives a lot of the reality of what Jesus has done for us in his work and the implications that has for how we're called to live. And in Ephesians 5, Paul turns his lens on how the implications of Jesus' work affects or really informs our understanding of our relationships within the home. And in that, he begins really with the idea of husbands and wives. And he gives lots of instructions in Ephesians 5, but towards the end, he makes a really interesting point. In verse 31, he says, quoting from Genesis 2:24, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So he notes the origin, but now he moves to the purpose. And this is what's interesting, that this mystery is profound. And I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. So Paul makes a reference to the origins of marriage, but then says the mystery of that reality actually demonstrates or points towards the greater reality of Jesus' relationship to the church. So the purpose of marriage actually is to be a picture. It's meant to be a living illustration to the world of the way in which God relates to his people. And we see actually that marriage is used throughout Scripture as a lens for how God relates to his people, that God draws his people together in union with him by covenant, by laying down his life in sacrificial love and inviting people to respond to that with love back to him. And so what we see is that marriage is ultimately designed and created to be a living picture of the way in which God relates to his people. And that's significant for the purpose. There's tons of implications that we could unpack that we're not going to do in this short video, but it's helpful for us to see that what informs the reality of marriage is it's not just designed for us, it's ultimately designed to communicate about something about God, which elevates the very purpose and nature of it in how we seek to practice it. That's why I think one of the things we really need to remember is kind of the call that Scripture gives us and how we relate to marriage. In fact, we encounter that in Hebrews chapter 13. Towards the very end of that passage, again, the author's giving several instructions, but in Hebrews 13:4, he says, "Let marriage be held in honor among all." And then he says, "And let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous." Some Strong's words there, but it's an important verse because the call to honoring marriage is to recognize its higher purpose. If marriage is just this mundane practice in our lives that maybe we get some joy out of, or it's just a temporary reality, or at the end of the day, its heart is really just about us and our happiness, well, then why hold marriage in honor? Why not just enjoy it for a bit, get what you can out of it, and then if it stinks, discard it, right? That's what we do a lot of things with the mundane reality of our world. But if marriage is actually about something bigger, about something greater, it's about communicating a story beyond ourselves, well, then it should be held in honor. Then we should be careful about the way we practice it, the way we discuss it, the things in which we engage. Oftentimes in our culture, we can have a very cavalier response when it comes to marriage. Watch any sitcom or TV show. Is marriage held up as an honor or an ideal? No. Oftentimes it's made a joke. We joke about the way people relate in marriage. We discard it. We celebrate practices that actually affect the way in which people are married, like sexual promiscuity and the effects that has. And so in our culture, marriage is not held in honor, but Christians are meant to be different. If we really see that its origin is in God and its purpose is in God, then the way in which we should really pursue it, talk about it, engage it, think about it is with this sense of honor, is with the sense of recognizing that higher reality. And so this is what I think we see across Scripture, and hopefully this helps you think about it in a little bit deeper way. If you have more questions or want to explore more topics, feel free to hit us up in the comments below. But thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Everyday Theology. If you want more content like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button.